Chapter 8. Will felt Horace's hand on his shoulder as the bigger boy began to pull him back from the two bandits. "Back away, Will," Horace said quietly. The man with the club laughed. "Yes, Will. You back away. You stay away from that nasty little bow I see over there. We don't hold no truck with bows, do we, Connie?" Connie grinned at his companion. "That we don't, Bart. That we don't." He looked back at the two boys and frowned angrily. "Didn't we tell you to drop those sticks?" he demanded, his voice rising in pitch and very, very ugly in tone. Together, the two men began to advance across the clearing. Horace's grip now tightened and he jerked Will to one side, sending him sprawling. As he fell, he saw Horace turn to the rocks behind him and grab his sword. He flicked it once and the scabbard sailed clear of the blade. That easy action alone should have warned Bart and Connie that they were facing someone who knew more than a little about handling weapons. But neither of them was overly bright. They simply saw a boy of about 16. A big boy, perhaps, but still a boy. A child, really, with a grown-up weapon in his hand. "Oh dear," said Connie. "Have we got our daddy's sword with us?" Horace eyed him, suddenly very calm. "I'll give you one chance," he said, "to turn around and leave now." Bart and Connie exchanged mock, terrified looks. "Oh dear, Bart," said Connie. "It's our one chance. What'll we do?" "Oh dear," said Bart. "Let's run away." They began to advance on Horace, and he watched them coming. He had the practice stick in his left hand now, and the sword in his right. He tensed, balanced on the balls of his feet, and they advanced on him. Connie with the rusty, ragged-edged sword snaking in front of him, and Bart with the spiked cudgel laid back on his shoulder, ready for use. Will scrambled to his feet and began to move towards his weapons. Seeing the action, Connie moved to cut him off. He hadn't gone a pace when Horace attacked. He darted forward and his sword flashed in an overhead cut at Connie. Startled by the sheer speed of the apprentice warrior's move, Connie barely had time to bring his own blade up in a clumsy parry. Thrown off balance and totally unprepared for the surprising force and authority behind the stroke, he stumbled backwards and sprawled in the dust. In the same instant, Bart, seeing his companion in trouble, stepped forward and swung the heavy club in a vicious arc at Horace's unprotected left side. His expectation was for Horace to try and leap back to avoid the blow. Instead, the apprentice warrior stepped forward. The practice stick in his left hand flicked up and outwards, catching the heavy cudgel in its downward arc and deflecting it away from its intended line. The club's spiked head thudded dully into the stony ground, and Bart let go a deep woof of surprise, the impact jarring his arm from shoulder to wrist. But Horace wasn't finished yet. He continued the forward lunge, and now he and Bart stood shoulder to shoulder. It was too close for Horace to use the blade of his sword. Instead, he swung his right fist, hammering the heavy brass pommel of his sword hilt into the side of Bart's head. The bandit's eyes glazed, and he collapsed to his knees, semi-conscious, head swaying slowly from side to side. Connie, backpedaling furiously through the sand, had regained his feet. Now he stood watching Horace, puzzled and angry. Unable to grasp the fact that he and his companion had been bested by a mere boy. Luck, he thought. Sheer dumb luck. His lips formed into a snarl, and he grabbed the sword tightly, advancing once more on the boy, mouthing threats and curses as he went. Horace stood his ground, waiting. Something in the boy's calm gaze made Connie hesitate. He should have gone with his first instincts and given the fight away then and there. But anger overcame him, and he started forward again. By now, he was paying no attention to Will. The ranger's apprentice darted around the campsite, grabbing his bow and quiver and hastily stepping his right foot through the recurve to brace the bow against his left, while he slid the string up into its notch. Quickly, he selected an arrow and knocked it to the string. He was about to draw back when a calm voice behind him said, "Don't shoot him. I'd rather like to see this." Startled, he turned to find Gillen behind him, almost invisible in the folds of his ranger cloak, leaning nonchalantly on his bow. "Gillen!" he began, but the ranger made a sound for silence. "Just let him go," he said softly. "He'll be fine as long as we don't distract him." "But," Will began desperately, looking to where his friend was facing a full-grown, very angry man. Sensing his concern, Gillen hurried to reassure him. "Horace will handle him," he said. "He's very good, you know. A natural if I ever saw one. That bit with the practice stick and the hilt strike was sheer poetry. Lovely improvisation." Shaking his head in wonder, Will turned back to the fight. Now Connie attacked, hacking and lunging and cutting with a blind fury and terrifying power. Horace gradually gave way before him, his own sword moving in small, semicircular actions that blocked every cut and hack and thrust, and jarred Connie's wrist and elbow with the strength and impenetrability of his defense. All the while, Gillen was whispering an approving commentary beside Will. "Good boy," he said. "See how he's letting the other fellow start proceedings? Gives him a good idea of how skillful he might be. Or otherwise. My God, he's got the timing of that defensive swing just about perfect. Look at that. And that. Terrific." Now Horace had apparently decided not to back away any further. Continuing to parry Connie's every stroke with obvious ease, he stood his ground, letting the bandit expend his strength like the sea breaking on a rock. And as he stood, Connie's strokes became slower and more ragged. His arm was beginning to ache with the effort of wielding the long, heavy sword. He was really more accustomed to using a knife to the back of most of his opponents, and he hadn't looked for this engagement to go past one or two crushing, hacking strokes to break down the boy's guard before killing him. But his most devastating blows had been flicked aside with apparent contempt. He swung again, losing his balance in the follow-through. Horace's blade caught his, spun it in a circle, holding it with his own, then let it rasp down its length until their cross pieces locked. There they stood, eye to eye, Connie's chest heaving, Horace absolutely calm and totally in control. The first worm of fear appeared in Connie's stomach as he realized that, boy or not, he was hopelessly outmatched in this contest. And at that point, Horace went on the attack. He drove his shoulder into Connie's chest, unlocking their blades and sending the bandit staggering back. Then, calmly, Horace advanced, swinging his sword in confusing, terrifying combinations. Side, overhead, thrust. Side, side, backhand, overhead. Thrust, thrust, thrust. Forehand, backhand. One combination flowed smoothly into the next, and Connie scrambled desperately, trying to bring his own blade between himself and the implacable sword that seemed to have a life and an inexhaustible energy all of its own. He felt his wrist and arm tiring, while Horace's strokes grew stronger and firmer until finally, with a dull and final clang, Horace simply beat the sword from his numbed grasp. Connie sank to his knees, sweat pouring off him and running into his eyes, chest heaving with exertion, waiting for the final stroke that would end it all. "Don't kill him, Horace," called Gillen. "I'd like to ask him some questions." Horace looked up, surprised to see the tall ranger standing there. He shrugged. He wasn't really the type to kill an opponent in cold blood anyway. He flicked Connie's sword to one side, way out of reach. Then, setting one boot against the defeated bandit's shoulder, shoved him over in the dust on his side. Connie lay there, sobbing, unable to move, terrified, worn out, physically and mentally defeated. "Where did you come from?" Horace asked Gillen indignantly. "And why didn't you give me a hand?" Gillen grinned at him. You didn't seem to need one, from what I could see, he replied. Then he gestured behind Horace to where Bart was slowly rising from his kneeling position, shaking his head as the effect of the hilt strike began to wear off. I think your other friend needs a little attention, he suggested. Horace turned and casually raised his sword, swinging it to clang, flat-bladed, against Bart's skull. Another small moan and Bart went face down in the sand. I really think you might have something, he said. I would have if you were in trouble, Gillen said. Then he moved across the clearing to stand over Connie. He seized the bandit by the arm and dragged him upright, frog marching him across the clearing to throw him, none too gently, against the rock face at the far side. As Connie began to sag forward, there was a hiss of steel on leather, and Gillen's sax knife appeared at his throat, keeping him upright. It seems these two caught you napping, Gillen asked Will. The boy nodded, shamefaced. Then, as the full import of the comment sank in, he asked, Just how long have you been here? Since they arrived, Gillen said. I hadn't gone far when I saw them skulking through the rocks. So I left Blaze and doubled back here, trailing them. Obviously, they were up to no good. Why didn't you say something then? Will asked incredulously. For a moment, Gillen's eyes hardened. Because you two needed a lesson. You're in dangerous territory. The population seems to have mysteriously disappeared, and you stand around practicing swordcraft for all the world to see and hear. But, Will stammered, I thought we were supposed to practice. Not when there's no one else to keep an eye on things, Gillen pointed out reasonably. Once you start practicing like that, your attention is completely distracted. These two made enough noise to alert a deaf old granny. Tug even gave you a warning call twice, and you missed it. Will was totally crestfallen. I did, he said, and Gillen nodded. For a moment, his gaze held Will's, until he was sure the lesson had been driven home and the point taken. Then he nodded slightly, signifying that the matter was closed. Will nodded in return. It wouldn't happen again. Now, said Gillen, let's find out what these two beauties know about the price of coal. He turned back to Connie, who was now going quite cross-eyed as he tried to watch the gleaming sax knife pressed against his throat. How long have you been in Celtica? Gillen asked him. Connie looked up at him, then back to the heavy knife. 10 or 11 days, my lord, he stammered eventually. Gillen made a pained face. Don't call me my lord, he said, adding as an aside to the two boys. These people always try and flatter you when they realize they're in trouble. Now, he returned his gaze to Connie. What brought you here? Connie hesitated, his eyes sliding away from Gillen's direct gaze so that the ranger knew he was going to lie even before the bandit spoke. Just wanted to see the sights, my... sir, he amended, remembering at the last moment Gillen's instruction not to call him my lord. Gillen sighed and shook his head with exasperation. Look, I'd just as soon lob your head off here and now. I really doubt that you have anything useful to tell me. But I'll give you one last chance. Now let's have the truth! He shouted the last two words angrily, his face suddenly only a few centimetres away from Connie's. The sudden transition from the languid, joking manner he had been using came as a shock to the bandit. Just for a few seconds, Gillen let his good-natured shield slip, and Connie saw through to the white-hot anger that was just below the surface. In that instant, he was afraid. Like most people, he was very nervous of the Rangers. Rangers were not people to make angry, and this one seemed to be very, very angry. We heard there were good pickings down here, he answered immediately. Good pickings? Gillen asked, and Connie nodded dutifully, the floodgates of conversation now well and truly open. All the towns and cities deserted, like. Nobody there to guard them, all their valuables left lying around for us and to take what we choose. We didn't harm nobody, though, he concluded a little defensively. Oh, no, you didn't harm them. You just crept in while they were gone and stole everything of value that they owned, Gillen told him. I should think they'd be almost grateful for your contribution. It was Bart's idea, not mine, Connie tried, and Gillen shook his head sadly. Gillen, Will said tentatively, and the ranger turned to look at him. How would they have heard that the towns were deserted? We didn't hear a thing. Thieves' grapevine, Gillen told the two boys. It's like the way vultures gather whenever an animal is in trouble. The intelligence network between thieves and robbers and brigands is incredibly fast. Once a place is in trouble, word spreads like wildfire, and they come down on it in their scores. I should imagine there are plenty more of them through these hills. He turned back to Connie as he said it, prodding the sax knife a little deeper into the flesh of his neck, just holding it back so that it didn't draw blood. Aren't there? He asked. Connie went to nod, realized what might happen if his neck moved, gulped instead, and whispered, Yes, sir. I should imagine you've got a cave somewhere, or a deserted mine tunnel where you've stowed the loot you've stolen so far. He eased the pressure on the knife, and this time, Connie was able to manage a nod. His fingers fluttered towards the belt pouch that he wore at his waist, then stopped as he realized what he was doing. But Gillen had caught the gesture. With his free hand, he ripped open the pouch and fumbled inside it, finally withdrawing a grubby sheet of paper folded in quarters. He passed it to Will. Let's take a look, he said briefly, and Will unfolded the paper, revealing a clumsily drawn map with a reference point, directions, and distances all indicated. They've buried their loot by the look of this, he said, and Gillen nodded, smiling thinly. Good. Then without their map, they won't be able to find it again, he said, and Connie's eyes shot wide open in protest. But that's ours, he began, stopping as he saw the dangerous glint in Gillen's eyes. It was stolen, the ranger said in a very low voice. You've crept in like jackals and stole it from the people who are obviously in deep trouble. It's not yours. It's theirs, or their families if they're still alive. They are still alive, said a new voice from behind them. They've run from Morgorath, those he hasn't already captured.